You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. The pain of losing a child is unimaginable. There's nothing a parent fears more. By the end of the First World War, Brisbane parents Charles and Mary Keed had lost not one, not two, but 4 sons. Bill was killed at Gallipoli. Leonard, Ted and Walter died on the Western Front. 2 of their other boys had also enlisted. Harry, the eldest, was wounded, but both he and the youngest, Guy, survived. History doesn't record how Mary dealt with her grief in the decades that followed. But in the weeks leading up to her death in 1941, according to a newspaper report, the 86-year-old Red Cross volunteer had been busily engaged knitting comforts for soldiers fighting far from home in another world war. In this episode, we discover the way 2 other mothers, Ethel Freeth and Adelaide Hendel, grieved for and honoured the memory of their sons. John Freeth died in 1943, Terry Hendel in 1966. I'm with Kerry Neale, curator of the exhibition After the War. Kerry, let's start with this black and white photo. There's a young man in uniform and a woman who looks like she could be his mum, wearing a very smart hat.
And that's exactly what it is. We've got here a photo of John Samuel Freeth and his mother Ethel, and it's between the period where John has enlisted with the Royal Australian Air Force. He's done a little bit of training and is about to head off to the UK. So it was probably one of their final outings as mother and son, him in his uniform and her so proudly standing beside him.
This photo was taken by one of the many commercial photographers, including returned servicemen, who snapped candid shots of lunchtime crowds and passers-by on the streets of Sydney.
It's quite interesting then, we don't know whether this photograph may have been taken by a First World War soldier of this young Second World War serviceman as he was heading off.
They look so happy in the photo, don't they?
They do. You can see that there's that sense of pride of a new officer wearing his uniform and that love and pride in his mother's face as well.
Now let's look at something else. This is a beautiful gold brooch with a little pin and a chain. I can see some little wings. Tell me about this brooch.
It's an absolutely stunning example of what we refer to as sweetheart jewellery. Now, sweetheart jewellery has a long history, starting with the First World War, where pieces were made to be worn by the mothers, the girlfriends, the wives of those men who were serving overseas as sort of a memento and a reminder of their loved one. So what we have here is this beautiful little fob that was actually made by the colleagues of John Freeth at Angus & Coote. So he was a jewellery salesman before he enlisted. So his friends, on hearing of his death during the war, actually had this brooch made for his mother, and it's engraved on the back, not to Ethel Freeth, but to the dear mother of John Freeth. So really giving her that title as his mother and making it even more special by having a photograph of him placed in the brooch.
Yeah, can you describe the brooch more for us? Because it is so beautiful.
It is lovely. So it's a little circular frame that has the photograph of John, and above that you have the wings, the RAAF wings, which you often see with sweetheart jewellery. There's usually a reference to the branch of the Defence Force that the serviceman or woman was enlisted in. And then it's got the little safety chain as well. So you can see it's quite a precious piece of jewellery with a lot of craftsmanship that's gone into it.
After training in Australia and Canada, John had been posted to an RAAF squadron in Scotland. He flew anti-German U-boat patrols over the Norwegian Sea. In April 1943, he piloted an aircraft that attacked and sunk an enemy submarine. His plane was hit with machine gun fire, but luckily there were no casualties. Then, just a few weeks later, the day after John's 23rd birthday, tragedy struck.
So on the 24th of May in 1943, John was flying a non-operational exercise flight over the sea off Fraser Borough in Scotland. and his aircraft collided with a Bristol Beaufighter from the 235th Squadron. So this was not an enemy attack, it was just an Allied accident. The aircraft went down with he and his crew. All 4 men died instantly, but only 2 bodies were recovered, and unfortunately John's was not one of those bodies recovered.
So he was lost in the water?
Lost at sea. It was almost 2 years to the day that he enlisted that he was reported as missing, presumed dead.
How did his mother take this news?
Unfortunately for Ethel, she could not accept the fact that the confirmation was that he was dead, not just missing, and she refused to believe that she had lost her son.
So what did she do?
She undertook correspondence to the Prime Minister, to the Minister of Air, basically any avenue that she could to figure out if perhaps her son had been recovered and was maybe suffering from amnesia and living in the UK, unaware of who he was and unable to get information back to her that he was alive.
This is just so sad that she could never accept that he wasn't coming home.
And we're talking about a series of correspondence that goes from his death in 1943, she starts writing in almost immediately, all the way through into the 50s even. And when she passes away in 1971, I still have this feeling that she probably, in her heart of hearts, believed that John was still alive and hopefully living a fulfilled life over in the UK.
The correspondence between Ethel Freeth and government authorities can be found in John's repatriation file.
The evidence that Flight Sergeant Freeth lost his life in an aircraft accident in the UK in May 1943 is conclusive. But Mrs. Freeth is one of the numerous mothers who will not accept evidence, and she has, since 1946, approached the former Prime Minister and the Minister for Air on the matter.
A few years after John's death, Ethel's hope was revived in an unexpected manner.
In December 1946, Ethel comes across a newspaper report of 2 former RWF pilots who have just broken a Trans-Tasman flight record. And she is sure that the blue-eyed, blonde-haired man who's in these photos as one of the pilots is her boy. And she actually writes in wanting confirmation that this Flight Lieutenant Lobb is her son and has simply been misnamed or has been living another life.
How did the authorities deal with that?
There's a lot of correspondence in Freeth's repatriation file that talks about Ethel actually phoning in to the Ministry of Air, asking for confirmation, and they simply have to provide evidence and confirmation actually from Flight Lieutenant Lobb himself saying that, I'm sorry, but I'm not your son, here is my story. And I think even then Ethel was not convinced.
Mrs. Freeth called again. She is still of the opinion that her son is alive. I explained the details of the crash and endeavoured to convince her that there could be no doubt that her son was killed and that it was impossible that he had taken part in a flight in 1946 under the name of Flight Lieutenant Lobb. She remained unconvinced but did not ask for any action to be taken and departed saying that God in his own good time would reveal the true facts.
The picture of John on his mother's brooch is from a black and white studio portrait taken in London, not long before he died. I'm wondering how often Ethel wore this precious brooch and what comfort it might have given her.
We don't know for certain, but I would certainly think that she would have worn it almost every day, really. It's one of those pieces that, in many other examples when we hear stories of pieces like this almost becoming little memorials for loved ones who have been lost at war, that they were worn every day of that person's life.
What do you think when you look at that brooch now?
It's one of those pieces that really speaks to you as someone who can just not accept a tragedy, that you can really see the love that she had for her son, the fact that she could not accept his death, and that even his friends at the jewellery store wanted to give her some sort of closure And in having something like this made, we're hoping to kind of bring it to a close for her.
Did she have any other children?
Not to my knowledge. I think John was her only son and her only child.
You're listening to Collected, Stories from the Australian War Memorial. I'm Louise Maher. Ethel's brooch is a beautifully handcrafted piece of jewellery. But Kerry and I are now going to look at a much simpler, everyday object, also imbued with the same sense of love, loss and memory. First, another photo.
So here we have Terry Hendel and his mother Adelaide. Terry's in his uniform just before he heads off to Vietnam in 1966. And they're just in front of the family home. It's a simple weatherboard house. They're simply standing outside enjoying the sun and probably one of the few afternoons they had left together before Terry went off.
And the object next to this photo is a tin with a picture of the opera house still undergoing construction on the top. Tell us about this tin and what's inside.
So as you say, you can see the Sydney Opera House under construction. It's a simple biscuit tin that was actually used as a fundraising for the building of the Opera House. But here it's been used to package up some Anzac biscuits that Adelaide has made for Terry while he's on deployment over in Vietnam.
Lance Corporal Terry Hendel was 20 years old with a wife and young daughter at home. He was deployed with the 6th Battalion Royal Australian Regiment and was serving near Nui Dat. He'd been in Vietnam for 6 months when his mum's tin arrived.
You can actually still see the tape that she sealed it with, and when we've been moving this object and situating it in the exhibition, you can actually feel the weight of Anzac biscuits that still remain in there.
Why are the Anzac biscuits still in that tin?
So this is where the sad story comes in. Adelaide and Terry's sister, Desley, would often bake biscuits and send them over to Terry while he was on deployment. And on the 29th of November 1966, this biscuit tin filled with Anzac biscuits and love from home was sent to Terry. Now that night, he was to head out on patrol, and he and his mates decided they would leave the biscuit tin sealed and waiting for them when they got back.
As a treat?
Exactly, it's something to look forward to, I guess. Unfortunately though, Viet Cong came in to the area where 6RAR, the 6th Royal Australian Regiment, were already camping and opened fire. Terry was wounded in sort of the chest, abdomen area at about 10:15 that night, and he was medevaced out to the 36th US Hospital in Vung Tau, but died of his wounds early that morning.
What happened to the tin of biscuits?
As is often the case with men or women who are killed on deployment, their personal belongings are packed up and sent back to their family. And of course, this unopened tin was packaged back up and sent back to Adelaide.
How must she have felt when she saw that tin unopened, when it came back to her like that?
I can only imagine, and what we did learn when the tin came into the National Collection just a few years ago was that she never baked Anzac biscuits again. For the rest of her life, the idea of baking these biscuits that she had baked so lovingly for her son and that he didn't get to enjoy, it was just too much for her.
As Kerry says, Adelaide never baked Anzac biscuits again, but she treasured the last batch she'd made for her son, Terry.
What's really remarkable about this object is that it's so everyday. Most of us have one of those little tins of old biscuits or something at home that's now maybe been filled with a little sewing kit or other relics. But this became almost a memorial to Terry. And for Adelaide, his mother, every time she'd move house, this tin would be the prized possession that she would carry on her lap in the car, not even willing to risk packaging it up with the rest of the household items.
The stories of Ethel and John and Adelaide and Terry are sad, like so many stories of war. But there's some joy to be found here too, in the comfort of gifts, given and received, gifts that are little reminders of love. Stephanie Boyle is the War Memorial's Senior Curator of Photographs, Film and Sound. Let's hear what she found in the oral history collection.
It was quite a common practice in the time of the Vietnam War to record audio letters home as well as send by regular post. And Don Barnby was one of those who recorded cassettes while he was deployed in Vietnam. And he sent them to his family, and those are here in our collection now. One of the things Don mentioned, and he talks quite freely to his family about environment of Vietnam and friends, is the climate in Vietnam, which is hot and humid and sticky. He says to his mother, "Mum, it would be great if you could send me some soap."
I just thought of something you can send up to me in the parcel, the soap. The soap up is army soap, and it doesn't do much for your skin or your hair, so if you could send us up a few cakes of that, it would be much appreciated. You're only allowed one shower a day here. It's at between 5 and 5:30. You have to walk about half a mile to the shower. The only good time you really feel fresh and really great is about half an hour after you shower.
Of course, Terry's mum sent the soap.
Thanks very much for that parcel you sent up. It was really great. It's what I wanted. I needed the pliers and the screwdriver for my rifle and that. And the soap came in handy, as a matter of fact. I ran out that morning. And it was much appreciated. It's very good.
As part of an oral history project, Stephanie spoke a few years ago to a leading seaman called Jody. It was after her naval deployment in the Middle East.
A very big part of shipboard life, as it is for anyone on deployment really, is the mail from home, the mail drop. And Jody was one of those who received packages from home, and she encouraged her friends and family to send her packages when she was on deployment. And I think in the beginning people didn't remember. And again, it sort of feeds into the emotional experience of somebody on deployment. If a lot of their friends are not also military, then there's a disconnect between those at home and those on deployment. And those of us at home don't really understand what people on deployment are going through and experiencing. And one of the things she mentioned was, although she loves her mother very much, and her mother loves her very much, her mother could never remember which ship she was on, which is kind of important if you want to get the packages to the right person.
Indeed.
Yeah, your ship name is your address. But she was delighted when she described to me in her interview, Jodie described to me in her interview that her birthday had come and gone without a package from her mum, and that was disappointing. And then the next mail drop was only a day or two after that, and inside it was a box from her mum containing all the things that a girl would need for comfort from home, things that aren't necessarily easy to get, feminine hygiene products, but also those little luxuries, the really nice smelling soaps and moisturisers and things like that. And the effect that it has on Jodie's morale is, again, uplifting. I think while she's talking to me about it, her voice changes and, she's recalling the sweetness of that memory.
My birthday was on the 8th and our first mail drop was on the 9th, the following day. And I can't remember, I think I was down there bringing on all the food and all that sort of stuff, and all the mail just went down in big bags, and so they sorted all the mail out whilst I was still helping on bringing all the food. And when I went down to the junior sailors, they said, "Oh my God, Jodie, I think the mail drop was just for you." And I had about 9 or 10 parcels for my birthday.
So what's it like to be a mum these days when your child is serving overseas? Stephanie spoke to Elizabeth just before her daughter Tamara left for Afghanistan.
And she expressed a lot of satisfaction that the army had been really good moulding experience and strengthening experience for her daughter. But she also held back tears thinking about her little girl, basically, about to go off to a war zone. And one of the ways she managed that anxiety was by preparing a care package for her daughter before she deployed. She had it all ready to go. She knew that Tamara would be away over Christmas.
She is well trained. I know what she's going into. I can sit here and I empathise with everybody who has been lost, and I've cried for them. And it's hard as a mother, but if I dwell on it and that, then I'll make myself sick. And that's no good. So my thought is that she leaves in 2 weeks' time, or in a week's time, really. I'm planning her Christmas. Yeah. So I've got a box of, baubles and tinsel and things like that, so that when she gets into country, a couple of weeks later, she's going to open up a box and it's got Christmas decorations in it, so that she can do up her thing. I'm not looking that she's going into this hostile place. I'm looking at how my care boxes are going to be for her, what part of the season is she going to be in. Tim Tams are the best to send over, they're like currency.
In the final weeks of her long life, Mary Keed, the mother of the 4 young men who died in the Great War, was knitting gifts for a new generation of soldiers, something to comfort them. Who knows what memories and mementos she kept of her sons. Ethel's gold brooch and Terry's biscuit tin are 2 very different objects, but they tell the same story. Curator Kerry Neale.
They do. It's about trying to come to terms with the grief that you experience when people die on a distant shore, or you don't even know their circumstances around their death or where they're buried. It's a way of harnessing that grief and that emotion into an object that can become a bit of a memorial to that lost love. And in both instances, we are talking about a mother's love and a mother's loss, and the fact that we've got things that have been in the family for more than 50 years before they come to us here at the memorial. It also shows how the families keep these items as precious.
A mother's love, a mother's loss, but a mother's enduring memory too.
Exactly. With Ethel, you almost see a sense of enduring hope as well, that she would rather have lived her life with the belief and the hope that her son had amnesia and would not come back to her, but would live a fulfilled life. And with Terry, it's about knowing that that object was probably one of the last things that he held and he looked forward to sharing with his mates, and knowing that it was a piece of home that had been sent over to him.